Now let's take a look at some delayed continuation bet examples. So here, under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls, flop comes 9-7-5, big blind checks, under the gun +1 checks behind. As you know they should pretty frequently on this board because this board connects really well with the big blind and not so well with under the gun +1, right? So now the turn comes and the big blind checks. This is a spot where this turn, pretty much no matter what it is going to be at least okay for the in position player. And that's because when it does go check, check on the flop, the under the gun +1 player's range is going to be relatively condensed. They're going to have a lot of medium strength hands that have a pretty good amount of equity and a lot of high cards that, are going to fare well enough. So if random high cards comes, it's fine too. So let's take a look at how the equity lines up. This is a little bit interesting, right? It turns out in position actually has a lot of equity. Obviously, the high cards are pretty good. It is worth noting here that the 9 and the 7 and the 5 are actually all good for the in-position player. And that's because the in-position player will check behind some of these medium strength hands, right? Like if they have a random 9 on the flop, sometimes they check. Same thing with a 7 and a 5. Okay? Notice that the 8 and the 6, though, are not especially great because when under the gun +1 checks behind, they usually bet their 8s and their 6s, which means when they do check behind, they don't have a whole lot of 8s and 6s in their range. Therefore, when these cards come, these are going to be better for the player in the big blind. Also, the under the gun +1 player has a big nut disadvantage then. So that's a scenario where we're going to see a pretty good amount of checking, but when under the gun +1 bets, it's going to be super polarized, right? So when you're betting polarized, usually you're going to be betting pretty big. Notice on the 9-7-5, when under the gun +1 bets the turn, it's often going to be with a small size though, because even though they do have lots of 9s, 7s, and 5s, so does under the gun +1, so you can't be betting very big in that scenario. Notice that the 2 is actually a really high equity card too, because the 2 is essentially a stone blank, right? When you get a stone blank on the turn, it's usually going to be very, very good for the stronger range going to the turn. Because remember, both players started, well, big blind started with a wide range on the flop, and under the gun +1 did not, right? They started with a pretty good range. And then when it goes check, check here, under the gun +1 still has a pretty strong range, despite the fact it went check, check, because they're really only betting very polarized on the flop, right? So under the gun +1's range is still reasonable here. Let's take a look at the betting frequencies. As we see, ace is the highest equity card, which is betting a ton. All the big cards are pretty good. Notice the 9, the 7, and the 5 bet pretty frequently, but bet using a small size, like I said, right? Because even though we have a big range advantage there, we don't necessarily have a huge nut advantage because the big blind does have lots of 9s, 7s, and 5s. Notice the 8 and 6 is bet 40-ish% of the time, which is a decent amount, but when it is bet, it is using a pretty large size because we're betting very polarized there. Okay? Let's take a look at the 6 of spades. So under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls, comes 9-7-5, both players check, turns a 6, and the big blind checks. Notice here that under the gun +1 has almost no premium hands. I listed Jack 9 suited as a premium hand. This is a hand that you're betting with the intention of folding, but it does not mind betting here. It's often the best hand, and it can certainly get some protection from whatever the opponent has. Whatever they have here has some equity, right? Notice aces and kings really don't want to bet and get raised, so these opt to check. If Jack 9 bets and get raised, you just fold. We have a few 8s. Not a lot, but we have some. So in this scenario, we have 10% premium hands, we're calling it, and we can balance that out with about 10% bluffs. The bluffs are going to be just lots of unpaired hands, right? Lots of just random junky hands. Notice that we bet a lot of the backdoor flush draws on the flop. So when we get to the turn, we just have the random hearts here and a few spades. So we're betting the spades in this scenario, and we're betting the random hearts that lack showdown value, right? So we're betting these draws as high equity draws, the ace high ones, and then we're betting these random king high as low equity draws that don't mind betting and then folding, right? Then we're checking marginal made hands. That's just like everything else pretty much here. We have a little bit of junk, but not a ton. So as we see, we are balanced out pretty nicely, and this is going to work out very well. We'll easily be able to call a lot of river bets. By the way, if it does go check, check on the turn and the river's an inconspicuous card or a card that pairs the board or something like that and the opponent bets, I am going to be doing some hero calling with ace high. And this is a spot where I think a lot of people fold out way too often. They just fold all their ace highs. And imagine here if I fold out all of my ace highs, notice that is a large number of combinations of hands, right? We have what, 36 here. There's 7, 8, 9, 40. 41, 42, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 46-ish or so marginal made hands up here that would have to fold to a river bet. And obviously that's just like all of these marginal made hands. That's a big chunk of them, right? So in this scenario, when it does go check, check on the turn, you should call the river some portion of the time, even with ace high, even though I know it's a pretty gross spot. Luckily, though, the pot will be manageable because there's no money in the pot, right? Whenever you have a marginal hand, you want to make sure you keep the pot small, and ace-king here probably wins when it checks down, but not if a lot of money goes in the pot, and so far we've put no money in the pot, which is optimal. So notice here, I was betting only 20% of the time. Solver actually bets a decent amount more than me. This is another spot where my strategy deviates from the solver strategy a bit, because take a look. The solver actually does have a lot of eights here. More eights than I did. And that's because it was using a slightly different flop strategy, right? So solver has more eights. Therefore, it gets to have more bluffs. Notice the bluffs that it is using are all of these random overcards, plus some ace highs, right, that have flush draws. Solver does bet ace-7 a decent chunk of the time, and it bets, what's it doing with jack-9 when it has it? It does bet jack-9 most of the time too, so it's probably viewing a hand like ace-7 and jack-9 similarly, like it's probably the best hand, and it's just betting for protection, which makes some sense. Also, Solver's a bit more protected when it bets than I am, because I don't have a ton of eights, right? As you have more nut hands, you get to bet a little bit thinner for value as well, because your opponent just can't raise you as often. So all this makes sense. Notice mostly ace-highs checking, aces and kings doing a lot of checking. Some sets checking as well, which is kind of neat. These are hands that are very likely good, but if you bet and get raised, it's pretty terrible. So be careful of those. But that is nice and good to see. Let's take a look at 9, 7, 5, ace. Remember, the ace is a very, very high equity turn card. So in this scenario, we're going to be betting very frequently, right? And interestingly enough, if you told me you wanted to bet like 100% of the time on this turn, I wouldn't fault you. Because if you go through and categorize our hands here, we have all of these strong aces, right? Then we have ace 4, 3, and 2, which are pretty good and probably capable of betting. We have kings, which is probably good, right? We have jack 9 and 10-9, which are still probably good. Then we have a lot of junky draws. So notice in this scenario, we have 50% premium hands. And if we took everything else, all these hands in green and blue, and bet them, it would still be 50-50, right? And that is the ratio we're allowed to have, 1-to-1 premium hands to quote-unquote draws. Here, our draws are just like super high equity draws, like the ace-4, right? It's obviously not a draw, it's a very reasonable made hand. But in this scenario, you certainly can just bet with everything, and in-game, that's very often what I would do. If you did elect to check these hands in green, you should fold some of them to a river bet, because it's always fine to fold out some of your hands to a river bet. We'll discuss river strategy later, but understand that like if it does go check, check on the turn and your opponent bets the river, given a hand like jack 9 and 10-9 are our worst hands, we should at least consider folding them. That said, it's probably fine just to call it off. But this is a spot where I do think betting everything is viable, given the way our range lines up using this implementable strategy. If we had a different strategy where we didn't have quite as many aces, or our range was just a little bit weaker, because we split up our range differently on previous betting rounds, like a solver will do, then you are going to want to do some checking. So in this scenario, solver does check 19% of the time. When it does check, it's checking kings, you see. King, queen. Notice I don't actually have a ton of king, queens. I guess it bets some of the king, queens. It's checking 8s and 6s some portion of the time, sure. King 7 for a marginal hand, sure. Notice it checks 10-8. This is a hand it doesn't want to bet and get raised off of. Remember how we talked about some of the draws that don't really want to bet and get jammed on? Solver will sometimes check, which makes sense. And then the low ace X that doesn't really want to bet and get raised also checks. That said, this is one of these rare scenarios where the solver really is betting a ton. Remember, whenever you get a turn that's really, really good for you, you get to bet very, very frequently. And typically, anytime it goes check, check on a coordinated board and the turn is a high overcard, especially an ace, that's a scenario where the in-position player usually gets to bet again very, very frequently.